not, is in Berlin and sends his greetings. I think it might help to our speaker if we were simply to go around the room and let everyone introduce himself, herself, very briefly. Mary?
I'm Barber, the Associate Director of the National History Center, and as usual, I want to encourage you, if you are new to us, or if you're not new to us but have never signed up to be on our Washington History Seminar mailing list, that you sign in with this on this sheet that's coming around. Thanks so much.
Harvey Kipper, Defense Department.
Stephen Shore, the PBGC.
Ross Johnson, Wilson Center Senior Scholar.
Landis Jones, University of Louisville.
Bryn Stoll, intern and recent graduate.
Bob Hathaway here at the center.
Bill Milam, Senior Scholar here at the center.
Zed David, Senior Scholar at the center.
Kent Hughes, I'm also here at the Wilson Center.
Sung from China.
Konrad Rausch, University of North Carolina and Zentrum für Zeithistorische Forschung, Potsdam.
James Sang.
Malcolm Byrne, National Security Archive at GW University.
Kui Liu, Academic Visitor of Woodrow Center.
Heidi Maurer, Austrian Marshall von Feller from the Center for Transatlantic Relations at SAIS.
Karolina Pomorska, University of Cambridge in the UK, visiting SAIS.
Kay Oshel, retired Department of Labor employee.
Mark Stout, International Spy Museum and a former History and Public Policy Fellow.
Ayaz Hussein, I cover Middle East and South Asia policy studies at the State Department Historian's Office.
Arnita Jones, historian.
Bill Burr, National Security Archive.
Ron Steele, Wilson Center Senior Scholar.
Hayden Peak.
I think most of you will know Gill Bennett as the chief historian at the Foreign and Commonwealth Office and as the senior editor of documents on British foreign policy overseas. Her books include Churchill's Man of Mystery, Desmond Morton, and the World of Intelligence, which was published in 2006, and her book that has just been published, 6 Moments of Crisis Inside British Foreign Policy. And I think the best way I can comment on the book itself is simply to read Peter Hennessy's comment on the back of the book. Gill Bennett possesses a very special gift. She could make old documents live and breathe. In this fine study, she takes us into number 10 in the cabinet room, and we're literally transported. We can see and hear the people, feel the tension, and hear the arguments. Gill Bennett on 6 Moments of Crisis.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Actually, hearing you go around the table saying where you're all from and is a perfect illustration from my point of view of why I wrote this book in the first place, because you show all the different aspects, both geographical and subject-based, of foreign policy, and that's part of what I have written about. I just want to say a little bit about where the book came from. Now, as you hear, I used to be the chief historian of the Foreign Office until 2005 and senior editor of documents on British policy overseas. This is, in effect, the British counterpart to your Foreign Relations series, and the very small group of historians in the British Foreign Office is the counterpart of the Office of the Historian in the State Department. They're just about 6 or 7 times bigger than we are in Britain. However, what that did give me for more than 30 years was a viewpoint from which, as a historian, and the British Foreign Office is now the only British government department which employs professional historians within it, gives you an inside view on how things work in terms of policy making. Now, I wouldn't claim that we little group of historians made any significant contribution to major issues over the years. Sometimes we helped, sometimes we were not required, but it does give you the insight from the inside looking out as to how it goes. And what that taught me over so many years was that actually I felt foreign policy decision makers in the British government got a rather bum deal. And I think that's actually true of decision makers in pretty well all governments, certainly democratic governments. People are always saying, how could the government take such a stupid decision? If only they'd known any history, they would never have done whatever it happens to be. They didn't know anything. I mean, you all recognize these arguments. And I thought I would like to try and just show for perhaps certainly the non-specialist reader how difficult it really is to take any decision on foreign policy. No matter how straightforward it may be, it is always complex. Now, scholars, perfectly naturally, tend to write about one aspect, a country, a decision, whatever it happens to be, without a broader context. That's perfectly natural. But what I wanted to try and do was to take some specific examples and look at it not in the light of what we now know happened or how we now know things turned out, but in the light of what people, the sort of pressures they were under at the time, how issues connected with each other, and what they were in a position to know at the time. Now, of course, it's important to analyse foreign policy decisions in the past, and of course, one should criticise them. But we should try and do so, in my view, from as informed a viewpoint as possible. And this is where history comes in. Now, I'm obviously well aware that the British governmental system differs in significant ways, which I don't need to tell this audience, from the American system. But I would argue, nevertheless, that the principles are the same. Your pressures may be differently exercised. You may have different constituencies to deal with. But the basic principles that decisions are complex, that they always involve a large range of issues, and that they are taken by people who are under considerable pressure. Don't tell me that that's not also true in the American system, because it seems to me that it must be. So where I actually started from on this was in reading the book Thinking in Time, which I'm sure you're familiar with, by Richard Neustadt and Ernie May, which precisely looks at this kind of decision-making methodology. But of course it is very much within the American system, and it tends to concentrate on domestic issues. Now, I think probably the principles apply to any sort of decision, but foreign policy is what I've worked on all my career, so I have confined myself to foreign policy. I'm going to just say, originally this book was not called 6 Moments of Crisis. Up until quite late on, it was called Challenging History, which was a title that I quite liked, but publishers take a different view. And the rationale for my thoughts were that it gives you 3 meanings of challenging. The first is that foreign policy decisions are always complex and challenging to understand. Therefore, we have to work at it. The second is that you have to that looking at it from the inside out may change your interpretation, so it may challenge what you already think. And the third challenging was because in each of the 6 cases I've taken, there is a challenge by the British government, whether it's to a person like Gamal Abdel Nasser, or an institution like the KGB, or a concept like Britain's world role. And here are my 6 moments of crisis. You can see what they are. I don't need to read them out. But in each case, I have changed the title because you have to do what publishers tell you. But I haven't changed the chapter titles because that really would have been just too difficult. So if you do look in the book, you will see that they are called Challenging de Gaulle, Challenging the Argentines, Challenging the KGB, and so on. Now, I began work on this book based on what I have called, with great hubris, Bennett's 2 golden rules of foreign policy making. And these may appear self-evident, but actually they're often, in my view, overlooked. Thank you. ministers make foreign policy. Now, you can extrapolate for yourself what the American equivalent is, but in the British government system, I'm talking about cabinet ministers. Now, obviously, lots of other people are involved in foreign policy making, whether it's officials, special advisors, the European Union, whether it's Washington, and all these, the military, intelligence, they all have an input, naturally. But only ministers, in the end, have to take the decision and take the responsibility. And in particular, only ministers have the authority to mobilize British armed forces. So although politicians, civil servants, military commanders, agencies, industrial leaders, trades unionists, and may, and often, of course, do express their views on foreign policy, which may be fed in and may be very influential, only ministers can take this decision. They are ultimately and collectively responsible for policy, and therefore, in my view, that makes them the decision makers, whether it's full cabinet or in committee. Rule 2, this is pretty damn obvious, but I still think an awful lot of people forget it. Ministers always think about more than one thing at a time. It seems obvious, but many people writing about foreign policy focus on a particular issue, and they tend to assume that ministers are doing the same. Now, of course, most ministers have a particular departmental responsibility, and with their advisors are to an extent preoccupied with that area. And in times of crisis, naturally, governments focus on the urgent matter in hand. But at cabinet level, no decision is ever taken in a vacuum. Even in cases where a foreign policy issue is handled by a very small group of ministers, they have to bear in mind other considerations, whether it's the views of their own parliamentary constituency, whether it's their party, whether it's the current electoral position, or budgetary restrictions on their departments, not to mention what might be going on elsewhere in the country and, of course, elsewhere in the world. So we've pretty well covered that, but I mean, those are very broad brush categories, but they are always pressures being exerted on the government. Now, this is especially true for prime ministers. And of course, it is true for presidents as well. Sir David Manning, who, as you know, used to be British ambassador in Washington and also was an advisor to several prime ministers, when I was talking to him about this, he said, never forget the influence of what he calls decision fatigue. By the time a prime minister has to address a decision, he said, it is by definition an extremely difficult one to take, because if it weren't, somebody else would already have taken it. I'm sure this applies in a presidential system too. By the nature of the Prime Minister's office, is responsible for the whole spectrum of policy, domestic and foreign, for the security of the realm, for the reputation of the government that he leads. Now, whether he took over from a member of the same party or an opposing party, prime ministers are always aware, and presidents, of course, always aware of precedent, and they always want to do better than whoever it was before. So I'm arguing that decisions are always difficult, complex, challenging. And the only way to get to the bottom of the decision-making is to try, first of all, to forget what we know about the consequences of the decision that was taken. Now, we can't eliminate hindsight, nobody can, but we do have to try. We have to try and put ourselves in the place of those who took the specific decision. Put yourself in my place. What could the decision makers have known at the time? What was the context, and so on. I'll give you a couple of examples for this. Looking at the Falklands, quite a topical issue at the moment, especially with the death of Baroness Thatcher. Now, when the decision was taken, which is in one of my chapters, to send the task force to the Falklands, now we all know now what happened about this. War, we win, right? However, it didn't look like that on the 2nd of April 1982. It was a very risky decision. And the first thing to remember is that although they decided to send the task force, nobody, including at that time the Prime Minister, seriously expected they were going to have to fight. It takes a very long time to sail to the South Atlantic. And there was confidence that before you got to that point, either the Argentinians would have drawn back from the brink, or there would have been some UN or better American intervention, that it wouldn't come to fighting. And of course, even if it did come to fighting, clearly they hoped to be successful, but they didn't know that they would. It was by no means a given. Suez is we're looking at 1956, a different end of the spectrum. When the cabinet took the decision immediately after the nationalisation of the Suez Canal by Nasser to try and reverse that nationalisation and indeed to unseat Nasser, as they put it in the meeting, they took the view that that was obviously what they had to do. They assumed that the Egyptians would not be able to carry on keeping the Suez Canal running. This is a totally wrong assumption, but it's what they thought at the time. They assumed that it would fall apart without European personnel running it. And they also assumed that they would have American support. As we now know, I know we're not putting that is not what happened, any of those things, but it's what they thought at the time, and we have to remember that. I'm just going to say a little bit about personal perspectives. For decisions are, of course, taken by people. And while it's impossible for us to put ourselves in the place of any of these people, there is lots of relevant information out there, biographical, relating to people's career, their health, their relationships, how long they've been in the job. This is particularly important to think of when you're thinking about prime ministers. As Peter Hennessy puts it, the dilemma of the job of prime minister is that its holders must be selective in their detailed interventions, but constantly sensitive to virtually the whole range of government activity. Therefore, the health and general well-being of the prime minister and other ministers is very important. So without presuming to be able to totally empathise with these people, we can take personal factors into account. Some of you may be aware of a very interesting book by David Owen, Lord Owen, called In Sickness and in Power, where he analyses the impact of the health of certain people on what happened at the time. And of course, he analyses Eden in respect of the Suez Canal, and he also analyses President Kennedy. Now, this is only one aspect, and of course, prime ministers, indeed presidents, tend to be people of enormous willpower and stamina who work on through the most terrible physical disabilities that would have felled other people. But nevertheless, health has to be a factor. Comments made by contemporaries, for example, about how people are looking, how they're behaving, how their health is going, we can take all these factors into account. The next thing is, of course, that context is absolutely key. And there are lots of ways to make sure that context is taken into account. You have to ask a lot of questions about every decision, no matter what the subject. Now, these are just a very few basics one. You could compile your own list of comparable questions which are applicable to the American system. But for Britain, certainly a key question is, how long is it till the next significant elections in the UK, including the next significant election in the US? And in my view, one of Eden's absolute mistakes in 1956 was to take the view that you could get any sort of support in a presidential election year, which seems to me he should have known better. But that's hindsight, we're ruling it out. How unified is the governing political party? And is there a powerful interest group involved in this? The Falklands is another example here. The Falkland Islanders, a very small number and a lot of sheep, as you know, extraordinary amount of parliamentary pressure that they exercised by having a very, very well organised interest group in Parliament. In fact, extremely well organised. What is the current economic situation and future prospects for the economy? Are any of the key ministers involved in the decision under particular pressure from personal factors such as being new to the job, health or personal relationships? Have their wives just left them? It does happen. Who is talking to whom on the issue? And how are their views being fed in? What is the likely media, parliamentary and public reaction to alternative courses of action? What do government officials, the military and coordinating bodies like the Joint Intelligence Committee make of the intelligence? Now, you can't always answer all these questions, clearly, but you have to ask them, in my view. And in foreign policy, this is particularly true. When I first started working for the Foreign Office historians, which is an extremely long time ago, I began life as a research assistant to the late Professor W.N. Medlicott, I'm sure quite a lot of you are aware of. And he was a very hard taskmaster, but his first question to me whenever I'd produced something for him was, what's going on in the rest of the world? It was his mantra. You must all, whatever it is, the crisis, wherever the crisis has arisen, what's going on in the rest of the world that may have a bearing on the issue at hand. It may not look as if it is, but this joined up factor is extremely important. For example, both the Suez and the Falkland crises have to be set against the background of European federalism. The Korean War has to be set against events in Central Europe. Britain's first application to the European Economic Community in 1961 has to be set against decolonisation in Africa. The decision to withdraw from east of Suez in 1968 has to be set against American involvement in the Vietnam War. And Operation Foot in 1971, when we threw out 105 Soviet intelligence officers, has to be set against the negotiation of quadripartite agreements on Berlin. Now, of necessity, government departments are divided geographically, but those people thinking about decision-making have to try and join up these dots. And when we look back at these decisions, we must try and join up the dots too, even if the decision-makers were not terribly good at doing it at the time. One interesting thing, going back to the Falklands again, is that John Nott, who was Defence Secretary during the Falklands campaign, very helpfully in his memoirs wrote a list of all the things he was doing the week before the invasion, which were nothing to do with the Falklands at all. His chief preoccupation was with the NATO nuclear planning group, which had met in Florida. He had been involved in a war games exercise. He had hosted a German delegation at Chequers, and he was on some very tricky defence contract negotiations, nothing to do with Falklands, but he'd listed these things. The week before the invasion, Mrs. Thatcher was in Brussels, handbagging the European leaders about the British budget rebate. She wasn't thinking about the Falklands very much, though of course it was the back of her mind as she was receiving news. But it was relevant because having given the European leaders a really hard time that week did affect how they responded to requests for help in the Falkland crisis. Her foreign policy advisor, Percy Craddock, later said that she wasn't very good at joining it up. She regarded these things as being in compartments. This one was that, this one was that. But, of course, people who have just been handbagged by Mrs. Thatcher don't tend to feel very friendly towards her if she asks them for something on a totally different subject. Similarly, in the spring of 1982, Anglo-American relations, despite the strength of Mrs. Thatcher's relationship with President Reagan, were not that good. We were fighting with the Americans about US pressure to impose stringent economic sanctions on the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe because of the declaration of martial law in Poland in December 1981. And unusually, for this case, the British were actually on the side of the Europeans, and their view was that these sanctions looked as if they were not going to damage the Soviet Union. They certainly weren't going to damage the United States, but they were damn sure going to damage the Europeans because they wanted, the American pressure was to cut off the gas pipeline project in which all the European major countries had a stake. So you see how these things go. So we need to ask, what's going on in Europe? This is for a British person, obviously, and what's going on in the rest of the world that may have a bearing on the issue in hand. The last thing I want to say is about options. Now, this is something that Neustadt and May are very good on in their book. And somebody asked me when I gave a talk last week, if you could just draw one lesson from all these decisions that I've talked about, what would it be? And I think my lesson would be that governments spend far too little time thinking, do we have to do anything? Now, this is a natural reaction, particularly in the current situation with the media, where everything is 24/7 media and everything is like, this has happened, Prime Minister, what are you going to do about it? The first reaction is we must do something. Too little time is spent thinking, well, actually, do we have to do anything? Now, Suez, of course, was a complicated issue, and I'm not going to get into it, though we can always talk about it in questions, but this was a classic case of this. Nasser had nationalized the canal. Now, canal, of course, runs through Egypt. It's run by an Anglo-French company, but you could see that Nasser could make some pretty good arguments for the nationalization of the canal. He promised that things would be able to, shipping would still be able to go through it, that things would run smoothly. Now, I'm not saying this would avoid a conflict, but nobody ever said, do we need to do anything about this? They said, we must do that. We must reverse this. We must do this. We must get rid of Nasser. And of course, a lot of things flowed from that. So I do think that the option of doing nothing is too rarely considered. That may be a counsel of perfection. The other thing is analogies. When you read the accounts of decision-making, and this is true in American as well as British circles, you find people talking about, this is just like Suez, this is just like Iraq, this is just like Munich even. I mean, when they are nothing like any of those things, people throw analogies around, and that can be a very dangerous thing. But it is what senior politicians are prone to, and you have to watch it. So, what is the desired outcome? This is another thing, I think, which I was having a discussion with somebody here in Washington about Syria the other day, about this. I mean, you have to think, actually, if you do this or that, what are you actually hoping to achieve? What is the end result? Now, again, this is a counsel of perfection, but it is something which everybody says you should be thinking about, what's the outcome, but they don't always do it. What new factor might change your decision? If you've got a very difficult decision to take, should you not be thinking, but if this particular element of the situation were to change, would that affect what we want to do? Now, you all know that in the heat of governmental decision-making, these kind of things tend to go by the board. People are just discussing what shall we do, how will we respond, what were our partners going to do, and they are spending very little time thinking about what might change or where do we really want to go. How would the options affect others? Now, clearly, if you are bound by bilateral or multilateral obligations, that should have some bearing on what you decide to do. But equally, you are all aware here that this is not always how it works. But it is, at least technically, an element of decision-making. And is one minister or a group pushing for action? Now, this is a tricky one. At the moment, of course, in Britain, as you know, the current coalition government is under severe pressure from the Conservative backbenchers about Europe. They're giving the Prime Minister a very hard time, suggesting that Britain should pull out of the European Union. It's a very noisy faction that comes and goes. There are other groups pushing for other things. Now, Prime Ministers, of course, have always got a view of their own, and they had their own ways of getting it through. And one of the things that I found particularly interesting when I was looking at these 6 specific decisions is the different tactics that different prime ministers use in order to try and achieve the result that they really want to go. From Attlee, who had a very low-key and idiosyncratic approach, to Mrs. Thatcher at the other end, who really was pretty brutal about trying to get her policies through a rather different. You would see if you see the chapter on the first British application to the EEC, that Harold Macmillan deliberately calls his cabinet meeting for a hot Friday afternoon in the House of Commons in his room. Now, nobody wants to be in a small room in the House of Commons on a Friday afternoon in July. They all want to have gone back to their constituencies or their home. They don't want to be sitting there with Macmillan saying, we have to take a decision now. And I concluded after looking at all the documentation, I mean, they didn't actually have to take a decision that day, but he damn well wanted to get it, and this was a pretty good way of doing it. In contrast to that, the decision to withdraw from East of Suez in 1968 is taken over a series of grueling cabinet meetings in January, presided over by Harold Wilson. Now, he adopted a quite different sort of stratagem. He said very little in these meetings, but at key points, you see him from the record just slipping in a little bit of support for the measures that he wanted passed, always at a crucial moment that would tip the balance. Then he'd say, clearly, there are more people in favour of this than there are against. It's very interesting to contrast their styles. In 1971, my only intelligence-led decision, and obviously it is interesting from that point of view, nevertheless, Sir Alec Douglas-Home, who was then Foreign Secretary, was very aware of the need to get several key developments in Europe settled before they told the Soviet government that they were going to throw out 105 Soviet intelligence officers. Now, that remains the single largest expulsion of spies by any country ever. There have been lots of little groups, there have been lots of tit for tat, but nobody has ever thrown out 105 at one fell swoop. And some people thought it was a very un-British thing to do. And they didn't tell the Americans first either, which is also a very un-British thing to do. But when you look at the decision-making, the decision had been precipitated in the end. They'd been hanging around waiting for the Berlin Agreement to be signed, waiting to see whether the Russians would actually promise to behave better in some other way. It's then precipitated by 2 particular events. One is that a British naval captain is arrested for spying, and the second is that a double agent, a KGB officer called Oleg Lialin, is arrested driving drunk in the Tottenham Court Road, and when arrested he says, "You cannot arrest me, I am a KGB officer." This kind of precipitated a little bit of action. And Lialin decided that rather than go home to Moscow, as he was ordered, he would spill the beans to the British about all the Soviet plans he was aware of, some of which, I have to say, are pretty bizarre, but nevertheless, they were alarming enough to push the British government into action. So, as usual, there are a range of factors. I think I've talked too much here because I would like to take questions on any of these specific. I will move back to the list of decisions so that you can think about whether you want to ask about any of them in particular. There they are. But I think I'm going to stop there if that's okay, Roger. Thank you.
Stephen, sure. 2 brief points. The first is, I wonder if your publisher was aware of the Title VI crises that President Nixon used in his book of a half-century ago. But my other question is the dog that didn't bark, of your selection of 6 and of why you did not have Cypriot independence in 1960 and the surrender of Hong Kong in 1997.
Okay, well, on the next, I mean, if the publishers weren't aware, I was, but clearly it wasn't regarded, I didn't regard it as a disqualifying factor, and they wanted to call it 6 Moments of Crisis. Okay. There are any number of crises one could have chosen, and I think Cyprus is obviously a major issue, but it is not in 1960 the key issue. And I tried to pick crises which I wanted to pick things which would be familiar to most people reading the book. Most people, they might not know the detail, but most people would have some awareness of the things I was talking about. And in 1960, Cyprus was important, but it didn't seem to me to be the key issue. I deliberately kept my choice within the period where documents are open, up until 1982, that is, because I wanted, again, these decisions to be accessible to people who could go and look them up themselves. They can go and look at the records. I mean, I only say a fairly small amount about each crisis. I mean, you could write a book on each one of these things, and of course people have written books on all of these things. But I was trying to illustrate a principle rather than talk about it. So I wanted things where people could look at the I mean, I have written books, Roger mentioned my book on Desmond Morton, which are based on information that is not available to other people. Now, that's a lovely privileged position for me, but it means nobody can then challenge you in quite the same way. And I wanted, in this particular case, to be challenged, but not too hard, in case anybody's got an idea there.
Jill, since you have mentioned accessibility to documents, I think the seminar would be very interested in the MI6 documents that will become available, impending, more or less.
Yes, I was telling Roger before we started, they're not actually specifically MI6 documents, but the Foreign Office is about to release a new batch of documentation from what is called the Permanent Under-Secretary's Department, which is one of those euphemisms, which was the name for a department which acted as liaison between the Foreign Office and the British intelligence community. And the first batch of these documents, which never used to be admitted to exist, was opened in 2005, but it only went up as far as the outbreak of the Second World War. And we're about to release 500 pieces of PUSD material going from 39 up to 1951 next month at the National Archives. And it does contain a lot of very interesting information. I wouldn't, it's not kind of shock horror revelations, but Roger mentioned when we were talking before the question of Ernest Bevin, the Foreign Secretary's attitude towards covert operations. There is certainly information in there about that and about the difficulties that the Labour government from 45 to 51 had in coming round to the idea that actually you couldn't just say, we don't do this. Which is quite interesting. So that there are a whole bunch of documents coming out, and it will be on the British National Archives website. It'll all be coming up during May.
At the very back.
Thank you. A little question. We are told in decision-making classes, the process of the decision-making, if the process of the decision-making is good, the result might not be good, like the process. Do you think it is, applicable for these cases?
Well, I have my doubts about process. I think the trouble is, obviously there always are decision-making processes, but they don't always get followed, and they're quite often derailed by events. They may be set, there may be a decision in a cabinet committee, it may move on, it may come to cabinet, but in the meantime, something else has happened in a different part of the wood. It could be domestic, you could suddenly have had a major economic problem, or it could be foreign. That derails the process. So I would be reluctant to, in my experience, to draw a direct line between the decision-making process and the outcome. Now, clearly, an orderly decision-making process should produce a better founded decision. But as Harold Macmillan, famously said, it's events, dear boy, events, which derail everything that happens. And so I just think you have to try and keep to your process, but always be aware that you never know what's going to happen tomorrow.
Yes, I can't see. Yeah.
A question about the role of British intelligence in fashioning of these decisions. In the United States, and I believe this is true in the UK as well, then what we call the intelligence community is supposed to provide needed intelligence information, but not be involved in the policy decision-making process. That, of course, is not the way things work here. And I'd be interested specifically on your 1971 example, but more generally, to what extent does MI6 or other parts of the intelligence apparatus actually have a more active role in policy making beyond simply providing intelligence information?
Okay, thank you. Well, in 1971 specifically, the decision that, and I should explain for those of you who about this book, that again, for in a way publishing reasons, what I've done in each crisis is to take one specific meeting. Now, it's a slightly artificial decision, but it's for the purpose so that you are kind of figuratively looking around the room. So if I'm going to be talking about the economy, I'm looking at the Chancellor of the Exchequer and I'm saying, this is the Chancellor and this is a little bit about them and this is the pressures on them, okay? Now, the meeting at which the decision was taken for Operation Foot in 1971 is conspicuous by the absence of any agency representatives. But that is actually deliberate. They have given their views at an official level. They have put in their advice and they have told the officials, if you like, a layer down, this is their view. And then it's for ministers to take the decision. I mean, obviously it varies over time because at the beginning of this period you've got the agencies, you've got the Joint Intelligence Committee, and over the years a whole lot more layers of analysis and synthesis have been added. I would still take the view, though, that it is, by the time we get down to the actual decision, that part has been done. Clearly, the agencies are tasked to prepare intelligence on whatever it happens to be. Suez is an interesting example on this because they were asked, what could we do? Eden wanted to know, what can we do? And it is noticeable that they produced a whole lot of fancy ideas, but very little, in his view, practical proposals. Today, of course, we now have, under the current government, the National Security Council, at which both the heads of the agencies and the Prime Minister, chaired by the Prime Minister. So there is more of an input, and of course, famously, after 9/11, there was a lot of personal input by the heads of the agencies. But as a normal rule, the process is followed. The advice is given at a certain level. It is synthesized by the relevant analysts and committees, and it is fed into the system. But then the political decision-making takes place separately from that. I mean, I'm not privy to all the details of all the committees, but that is how it works in Britain. And unless in times of extreme crisis where the agencies are brought more into focus, that is the rule.
I certainly have the impression that traditionally, historically, there is less political interference in the intelligence process in Britain. There are certain examples, exceptions such as Iraq, but usually there is no political influence on the...
I mean, one of the things that sometimes distorts perceptions of all this is that quite a few books are written about the British, I'm not talking about the official histories, British intelligence agencies, which can give you the impression, if you don't know better, that they carry on quite independently of government, taking their own decisions, making their own policy. And I can think of more than one book about the Secret Intelligence Service, MI6, that is, which barely mentions the rest of the government at all. Now, in real life, the agencies are tasked by government with producing intelligence for whatever purposes. And their job, they are requirements in intelligence terms, their job is to do that. Their job is to not think, what shall we do about this? And go off. Now, clearly, they do have views, and they feed those views into the decision-making process, but I think it's very important to remember that it is all part of the same system. And again, there are quite significant differences in all this, as Roger says, between the British and American systems, but that's how it is at my end.
Yes.
If I could just maybe pile onto that intelligence topic, I'm just back from the International Studies Association, where former CIA analyst who now teaches at Brunel in the UK gave a paper about U.S. intelligence, and he argues, I'm not sure I agree, but he argues that in the post-World War II era, that there has been no case in the United States in which strategic intelligence analysis has led decision makers to make any decision contrary to their initial policy preferences, i.e. that strategic intelligence analysis has been essentially irrelevant in the United States. And I'm curious, if you were to change that hypothesis to the UK, would you agree, disagree, or take a pass on that?
I certainly can't comment. I wouldn't like to comment about the US, but I mean, I would find it extraordinary if such a generalized view were in fact true on either side of the Atlantic, because it seems to me that it's always more complicated that. But I mean, certainly, for example, in 1971, the British intelligence agencies are taking the view, well, especially MI5, whose business all these Soviet spies within the UK is as a domestic agency. They want action. But, excuse me, but the political strategic appreciation is rather different, and both sides accept that they are coming from different. So, whether it changes it, I think this is. I really wouldn't feel qualified to say. But one thing, actually, not from this book, but it's something I've been working on in connection with these opening of the papers that Roger mentioned, is that I've been writing a piece about the 1945 case of Igor Gutsenko, the Corby case, the first really big kind of espionage, Soviet espionage. And that, what the British files show on that, which I find is very interesting, is how the intelligence is, in a way, is put to one side because of purely political consideration, much to the annoyance, I might say, of Attlee and Bevin, who tend to take the view that you've got the evidence that there's all these people operating, they should be arrested. But the Canadians say they will only do what the Americans say, and Truman says, I'm looking to do a deal with Stalin over atomic energy and the possible uses of raw materials and so on. I don't want to upset them. And it's in fact 6 months before anything is done about Gutsenko's, anything significant is done about Gutsenko's information, by which time, of course, the stable door has long, but it's an interesting. It's in my experience in the early Cold War. It's the first time that these discussions about, well, actually, what we're going to do, politically, and what you can do politically, and what the intelligence telling you are pulling you in quite different directions. Yes, sorry, you've been waiting a long time over there.
Could we ask people to reintroduce themselves when they ask the question?
Kent Hughes here at the Wilson Center. I was just wondering about the different structures of our government. Case here where the president has some 3,000 political appointees, some of which may go as far down as a DA, Deputy Assistant Secretary, or even an office director. Those of us who watch Yes, Prime Minister are convinced that Sir Humphrey really makes all these decisions. And the other element that seems common is that ministers move from post to post. Well, here if it's a significant post, Secretary of Defense, for instance, it usually is someone with a strong defense background.
Yes, as you say, we do it quite differently. We do not have political appointees in the civil service. The only, if you like, political appointees are special advisors, which ministers can bring in, but there are not very many of those. But in the civil service, the officials in government departments, they are not political appointees, and they do not change with the administration changing. And famously, the civil service is not supposed to be politicized. You just get on with it, and whoever is in power, you serve the government that you're working for at the time. Sir Humphrey, well, permanent secretaries are the administrative heads of all the various departments of state, and clearly for major departments, defense, the Treasury, Foreign Office, those people do have considerable influence, but it is more an influence on the general overall direction of the department. And I mean, they do feed into policy, but that's not what they are there for. And of course, in number 10 Downing Street, in the Prime Minister's office, there will be advisors from the different departments. They're not political advisors so there'll be a foreign policy advisor on Europe, and there'll be a foreign policy advisor dealing with other things. There will be a Treasury advisor who there to translate, but that is not the same as Sir Humphrey. What Sir Humphrey is there for, and that is quite right from the, although it's obviously a caricature in the series, is to say to ministers sometimes, are you quite sure, Minister, that this is what you really want to do? Are you quite sure? And actually, in some respects, that's what I consider the historians. I wouldn't claim to be a Sir Humphrey, but absolutely. One of the Foreign Office historians have two main tasks. One is to produce the documentary series, which we've spoken about, and the second is to offer what's called historical advice to senior officials and ministers. Now, this is a completely flexible, it could be just giving somebody a speech, a joke to put in a speech, or it can be a major piece of research that takes months. And it could be on absolutely anything. Now, you're quite right that ministers may be moved from one department to another, and the department that they're moved to, they may know very little about. I would not, this could well be a weakness in the British system, but this is what it is. And it's one of the reasons why in my questions that you need to ask about decisions, one of my questions is, how long has the minister been in his job? And now, a lot of these people are very good at getting up to speed quickly, and they draw on the experience and the expertise of their officials, who, of course, have not just come in with the new administration. They may have been there a long time, so there are a lot of experts around. But it can be very difficult for a minister. On the other hand, it could be an advantage. Now, in 1967, when Britain devalued the pound, James Callaghan resigned as Chancellor of the Exchequer, as he had promised he would if we devalued. Then Roy Jenkins comes in as the new Chancellor, and Harold Wilson said to him, go and make up, go and write what he called a post-devaluation package that would satisfy the IMF and others. And Jenkins was able, with a clean slate, if you like, to perhaps put things together in a way that a minister had been there a long time and not now. It's very difficult to judge these things, but you're entirely right in saying it's a completely different ballgame.
Ross Johnson. Any top executive faces the challenge, or should face the challenge of finding a way to bring in other points of view, avoiding groupthink, bringing in the perspective of a B team, whatever different ways to do that. Are there ways that that's worked in the British system, and particularly the '56 crisis? Was there anybody sort of in the spectrum asking the question, as you say, do you really want to do this? Are your assumptions correct? And more generally, is there any institutionalization of this kind of looking in a constructive way for other points of view?
Oh, there certainly are ways of doing this, and I mean, when you were saying that, what came particularly to my mind, in fact, was from 1961, where Macmillan had actually had a big team in the Treasury working on this question of what should happen about a possible British application to join the EEC. And he had taken a certain amount away from that. In 1956, there certainly were different, in the Foreign Office had a viewpoint. The military had an entirely different viewpoint as to what should happen about Suez, and there were very many people, but the fact is, in the end, Eden's view as Prime Minister was that nobody put up to him a credible alternative view. Now, we can argue about whether he was right, but that's what he felt, that nobody put up to him a credible alternative strategy to adopt in respect of NASA's nationalisation of the canal and what we're going to do about Egypt. And when it comes to cabinet, and this is true for other decisions as well, you know, people now lambast Eden for what he did. The cabinet, you know, basically supported him, and this is true in all sorts of historical people. It's always somebody who carries the can, and of course, you know, in many cases that's right. But the fact is, Mrs. Thatcher had already decided that she wanted to send the task force by the time the cabinet met on the 2nd of April 1982. But she was also very sure that she needed to get her colleagues signed up to that decision. I mean, largely, these things happen because if it all hits the fan, you're all in it together. And that's actually quite important for prime ministers. So yes, there are other ways of doing it, but in the end, it comes down to one of my golden rules. It's ministers who make policy. And if they consider that the alternative, you like the B team's analysis, is a good one, it could be adopted. But if they don't feel that it is, then it's just put on one side.
James Sang, in your previous answer regarding Callahan and Jenkins, you used a word which shows up here in the United States occasionally, resignation. There's always a criticism that the U.S. system has no great tradition of resignation. Certainly in '82, I guess there was a resignation. Carrington resigned. And you just said that Prime Minister has to bring his or her cabinet along together. Has there been any cases where, in fact, the threat of resignation or the actual use of resignation has made a difference in the decision process?
I mean, of course, Carrington's resignation came in the aftermath of the decision, and it was really because he felt that politically there had to be a sacrifice. John Nott offered to resign, and Mrs. Thatcher refused. She thought that he needed to stay. It is a difficult situation. In 1967, when we're talking about Callahan, there's no doubt from the documentation that although Callahan is a very powerful political animal, or perhaps because of this, Harold Wilson was not altogether sorry when he resigned as from being Chancellor, partly because he thought it was a good idea for a new person to put together the new policy, but also because he thought it diminished a potential political rival. So things are never quite as straightforward as they look. I can't just think, but there probably are. I can't think off the top of my head of cases where a threat of resignation actually changed policy. Of course, in Harold Wilson's government, before he finally did resign, George Brown was always threatening to resign. And he was usually talked round, but I wouldn't say that changed policy. And of course, if you're looking back at other examples, Eden himself resigns, of course, in 1938 from Chamberlain's cabinet, but that's not going to change policy. So I think it's usually by the time you get to a resignation, it's too late to change the policy. They're resigning in protest to a decision they don't agree with. But that, it's quite unusual. Yeah, yes, I mean, in the American system, it doesn't really happen. I mean, people are forced to resign for various reasons, but they don't usually, is that right? They don't usually resign on a matter of principle, or do they? I mean, you can give me... Cyrus Vance did, yes, 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 yes.
Arnita?
I'd like to go back to a couple of things you said a few minutes ago. I'm particularly interested in government history in general. And you mentioned that the office in the Foreign Office of Historians is the only one in the British government. That's very different from here, where there are a number of historical offices threaded throughout agencies as well as cabinet-level departments, not to mention the military. And you also noted that the historical office at State Department is much larger than the one. I'm just curious as to what you might attribute that difference to. I mean, the civil service and its different role in the UK, perhaps?
No, money, I'm afraid. A number of other departments did used to have historians. The Treasury had one, quite a big one, which it abolished in 1976 at the time of the one of our financial crises. In the military, there is still an air historical branch and a naval historical branch who work on specific issues, but they don't fulfill the same kind, they don't employ outside historians, and they don't publish in the same way, and they don't fulfill quite the same role. The Army Historical Branch, as it used to be called, but it's called, they keep changing its name, and it's called something completely impenetrable by information, brackets, exploitation, close brackets, and that anyway. But we used to have a lot to do with them, and we used to do a lot of work with them. But what they have got almost completely caught up with are legal issues, in response to inquiries, about whether it's
freedom of information requirements?
No, not those, but where there has been, where the Ministry of Defence is being challenged, for example, how it treated a set of particular servicemen at a particular date, and there may be some kind of class action. The historians there, and again, they're internal rather than external historians, have got almost completely, and they don't do any outward-facing work anymore. The Cabinet Office does employ professional historians on specific projects. So, for example, to write an official history of a department or whatever it is. But they are people who are just taken on for that specific task, and then they go away again. And they don't provide any, what I would call, historical advice. But the unfortunate fact is that in times of budgetary restriction, which we have fairly often, historians tend to be an easy target. And in fact, it's one of the dilemmas of yes, we are envious of the State Department's 45+ historians, but equally, the British Foreign Office historians are small enough that on the whole, we wouldn't save much money. And actually successive ministers have accepted that what they would lose is far more than what they would gain. But the historians have been under threat since I joined the Foreign Office, which is, over 40 years ago. And so nothing much changes, but luckily they survived. But it is a question of resources, I'm afraid. Obviously, departments do sometimes take on a historian to help them with a specific thing, or they bring, like Professor Sir Hugh Strawn, for example, has been helping the Ministry of Defence on various specific issues. But the Foreign Office actually keeps a cadre of professional historians within it, and for that it is unique at the moment.
Thank you very much. My name is Heidi Maurer. I'm at the Center for Transatlantic Relations, and I'm a political scientist of background, so thank you very much for this historian perspective. That's very interesting for me. If you allow, I have two questions. The first one goes about the role of public opinion. So I was just wondering, during your analysis, did you find that public opinion and public deliberation mattered for the ministers to make their decisions? Especially because in political science, we always say that foreign policy decisions are a bit more insulated and a bit further away from public discourse, and that there's more room for policymakers. So this would be my first question. And my second question relates to your alternative title of Challenging History, where you said it's about challenging pre-existing interpretations. And I was just wondering, despite all your expertise and your long-standing career in foreign policy analysis, what were your personal 2-3 insights that really surprised you the most?
Okay, thank you. Public opinion. My view is that actually it's always taken into account, but in the sense that ministers really worried about what public opinion might be, rather than the fact that any expression, I mean, it depends what you measure public opinion by. I mean, especially in the earlier period, we don't go in for lots of opinion polls and so on. There's various, but if you're looking at what's in the press, what's on the newspapers, every single one of these decisions, government discussed how will the public receive this? How will this go down? The Falklands is obviously, it's a question of, there's a tremendous press thing about British territory invaded. We must fight back on it. But it goes all the way back, and it's the same in 1950 when they're talking about Korea, about sending British troops to Korea. There they are worried about the public perception of using money for a military adventure, some might think it was, at a time when money was needed for domestic policy. But of course it depends on which newspaper you read. Certainly all governments take into account the potential for, after all, they're thinking about their voters. They think, if this has a very bad public reception, well, we won't win the next election. I mean, that's come down to it at all. In 1968, it has become a slightly different perception, because by this time you are getting more reporting. In Vietnam, for example, in 1968 in Britain, there's really quite a strong public reaction against the Vietnam War, and indeed a very strong opposition to the idea of any British military presence. And part of that is because of what they can now see on the television, and there are more camera crews actually in Vietnam, and they're seeing pictures of awful things. That brings it much more home, and of course this is writ large in the more current. If you're talking about what are my insights, I mean, I think it's confirmed me in my view that it's always far more difficult than it looks, and I do think that the weakness of governmental decision making in Britain is what I said earlier. Really, the lack of any time to stand back and say, let's just think. Do we need to react? Now, I know this is a counsel of perfection, but it's partly to do with the power of the media, which in Britain certainly is extraordinarily distorting to how issues are presented. And sometimes you read stories in the press and you think, this is a country that you're not living in. But it depends on whether you are on the right or the left or somewhere in the middle. So it would be stupid of me to say that an insight is that, the media distorts foreign policy, or that ministers should have more time to think. But I do think my chief insight is that history can help with decision making. I thought that anyway. I wouldn't I? But it's confirmed me in that belief, not because you can think, well, this is just like then, because it never is just like then, and history would be a foolish guide to future courses of action, but it can provide the insight into issues. And that one thing to do with always ask, ministers should have it taped across their forehead, what's going on in the rest of the world. And that is something that history can help you with. but you've got to let it. Sorry, that's the best I can do on that.
On the decision to withdraw troops east of Suez, I'm sure you're right about Vietnam being in the background and the media, the television and so on, but I've always thought that it was the economic issue that was, you know.
Oh yes, the economic issue was the reason for the decision. But also, I mean, one of the interesting things about this decision to me is that it's the one that was taken in absolute defiance of strongly expressed American views that we should not take the decision to withdraw from east of Suez, or at least not in the time frame proposed. Now, my private view, which I cannot support, but I still think it's true, is that when Harold Wilson and Johnson went to the funeral of the Australian Prime Minister after he drowned in December '67, that they had a conversation at which Wilson said, this is what we're going to have to do this. So, and in the end, I think he made a deal, because even though there's a lot of argument about whether British mediation with North Vietnam through Moscow had any effect at all, the fact is Wilson was asked to do it on a number of occasions by the president. He must have asked him for a reason. He must have felt there was some utility in this, and it did give Wilson a bargaining chip in this question of the Americans. But when George Brown, the Foreign Secretary, came over and announced the decision to the State Department, he received a very, very rough ride. He said, how can you do this? You're not going to be, we were trying to cut down troops in Europe as well. I forget the exact quote. It's something like, you're not going to be east of Suez, you're not going to be in the Middle East, you're not going to be in Europe. Where are you going to be? It was a very rough ride. But I think personally that Wilson had A, squared it with Johnson, and B, had decided that the economics were just too pressing. That's just what you had to do.
This was when Dean Russ said, be British.
Yes, be British, yes. Quite.
Question about sources and documents, and I should probably know the answer, but I haven't worked in British documents. In the United States, as you know, it's a painful process and a arbitrary process to get things declassified. An example is some of the American documents from 1956, the NSC documents dealing with Eastern Europe. After, umpteen redactions and so on, finally, I mean, only last year, and thanks to Malcolm Byrne, primarily in the National Security Archive, we get integral texts. Now, do you have sort of in dealing with Suez, have you had sort of the integral documents on the British side that illuminate the decision making, or are there the same kind of issues that come up in terms of release and redaction?
Most things on, the only things on Suez that are not in the public domain now, but are purely intelligence documents, of which there are some that are still held back, and I would say a lot of which are held back at the request of the Americans. But they do not affect the decision making in the sense that I'm talking about it. Of course, we have a 30-year rule. Now they've decided to make it a 20-year rule, but again, as Roger and I were discussing before, governments are very good at saying you must release everything that's less than, it's more than so, but they don't let you have any resource to do it. And I think it's going to be extremely, well, in fact, impossible unless things change to meet the targets, because you just don't have the staff to do it. And as you all know here, reviewing and clearing and declassifying and processing documents for release is not something that can be done in 2 minutes, and it needs good people to do it. Having said that, in principle, anything that is more than 30 years old is out there, with the exception of specifically intelligence-related, and obviously occasionally some things for all sorts of reasons, but basically, and there's an awful lot out there. Suez, I think, is in a way, one of those odd things that everybody, I've said this in the book, but everybody thinks they know about Suez. They all talk about, oh, you know, the most shameful episode, it was this now. I'm not saying that there weren't things wrong, but a lot of people do not then go, I mean, Roger's one of them, Roger knows all about it, but go behind and say, well, actually, one thing I always draw attention to is the fact that in 1956, for example, Israel was mounting a lot of border raids on Jordan. Britain was bound to Jordan by treaty to defend Jordan from attack. The British military, as instructed, were preparing plans for defense of Jordan if required. If you are Anthony Eden and you're Prime Minister and you're really worried about Nasser and what Nasser's doing in Egypt, and you're faced with a military plan that implies you might end up fighting Israel, whose air force is manned almost entirely by the French and who is supported by the Americans, while in Eden's view, Nasser is laughing on the sidelines. Now, I've oversimplified, so you know, I know there's a lot more to it than that, but you can see how this could reach a situation which, for Eden, who is unwell, we know that, and is completely frustrated by the lack of anybody giving him what you talk of B-team strategy, a military strategy to fight Israel does not seem to him very helpful. But it's an aspect, people have written about it, but it's not usually factored into the everybody wants to talk about collusion. My view, maybe an unpopular one, but I shall say it anyway, is that by the time the French come to Eden and say, I have a cunning plan, he's at the end of his tether. And the other thing I would leave you with is, if Suez is, you know, the French and the Israelis are just as much involved in collusion as we are they still beating themselves up over it 60 years later? No.
We should begin to draw this to a close, so last questions.
Stephen, sure. About Operation Foot, I recall that the Soviets expelled about 150, if not exactly 150, British diplomats, and I'm wondering if that's correct. Was that considered in the decision to expel the Soviets?
No, it was nothing to do with numbers, and expulsions had all been in bits and bobs and tit for tat. I can't tell you what the numbers were, but there was no mass expulsion. And that was not what the 105 was. They reckoned, MI5 reckoned there were 1,000 Russians involved in espionage on the UK mainland, roughly, at the end of the 1960s. But you had to try and give the names of the ones you could prove it, and that it needed to be a sufficient number to be really impressive. But you wanted to keep some names back in case the Russians retaliated in such a way, and you might have to do another wave. Now, in fact, retaliation was very small, and it really did deal a blow to the KGB, but it wasn't a numbers game in that point of view.
Jill, I thought, Marion Barber from the National History Center, I thought one of the most interesting things that you said was that it's important to know how the persons who were making these decisions or taking these decisions actually felt at the time. And I think that one of the most remarkable examples of a way to know that has been the Johnson tapes, the Nixon tapes, Kennedy tapes. Are there any similar resources available to you on the British side that give you that same sense of immediacy and sense of, I can tell this person is tired?
Not in terms of recordings, no. I mean, certain conversations are recorded with, you know, the Prime Minister's talking to, but they're not kept. So we don't have that in the same way at all. And it is very difficult to be sure of what people were feeling at the time. I did make a lot of use of diaries. Now, I entirely accept that diaries are potentially unreliable and so on, but if you can take several diaries of people at the same time and their individual perception of what was going on, then that helps. And I think, you know, even now, if you read, I don't know if anybody here has looked at any of Alistair Campbell's published diaries. Now, they're very, very detailed, but to me, they give you an absolutely good feel for not just what happens, but how people are feeling. Now, obviously, they have been edited. I mean, difficult, but we don't have the kind of raw material that you have here. We don't have, perhaps I think a lot of British politicians would say, thank God.
A last question. In that case, Jill, we want to thank you.
Thank you.
Interesting.
I am, yes.
So will the MI6 include anything on Iran, 251? Will there be Iran, anything on Iran?